Welcome to another deep dive today. We're going to be looking at the book of Proverbs, specifically chapter 1. Probably a lot of you guys know Proverbs, it's that collection of wise sayings and teachings. Not really a straight narrative, but more like a guidebook kind of for living a good and meaningful life.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting about chapter one is it really sets the stage, for everything that follows. You get those big themes you're going to find throughout Proverbs. So wisdom, foolishness, righteousness, all those consequences of the choices you make, it all starts here.
Right. And it's written as advice from a father to his son, but it's wisdom that we can all apply, to our own lives, no matter what stage we're at. So let's just jump in. The first few verses, like verses 1 through 6, those lay out the purpose of seeking wisdom.
Yeah. And I think the big thing here is that it's not just about, getting knowledge. It's about actually putting wisdom into practice.
Yeah.
So look at all those benefits that are listed: gaining instruction, understanding, insight, behaving prudently, acting justly, gaining knowledge and discretion. These are all active qualities, ways of being in the world.
So it's not just knowing the right answer, it's about living them out. Yeah. Now, one of the most well-known verses in this chapter, maybe even the whole book, is verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. What do you make of that?
A lot of people get tripped up by that word fear there. It's not about being terrified of God.
Right.
It's more about having deep respect and reverence for a higher power, understanding that there's like a moral order to the universe. Think of it like this: if you're trying to navigate through a city you've never been to before, having a good map makes all the difference.
Yeah.
Right? In the same way, acknowledging a higher power and having like a moral compass, that provides a framework for making sense of life and making wise choices.
So in a way, fearing the Lord is like trusting that there's a bigger picture, right?
Right.
Like a design that we can tap into.
Exactly. And that leads to true knowledge and understanding. Now, things get really interesting in verses 10 through 19. We see this really, really vivid scene where these sinful men, they're trying to tempt the son into doing something wrong.
It really is like a movie. Like lie in wait, swallow them alive, fill houses with plunder. These are pretty intense images. And it's interesting too how they use those specific temptations, quick riches, the allure of belonging to a group, the thrill of doing something that's forbidden. I mean, these are all things that we can relate to even today, right? I mean, who hasn't, been tempted by a get-rich-quick scheme or just wanting to fit in?
Right. And the chapter's not saying that those desires are inherently bad. It's about, recognizing the potential danger when those desires are the things that are controlling us. Notice the warning.
Yeah.
Those paths, they ultimately lead to destruction, even for those people who think they're in control.
So it's a cautionary tale reminding us that actions have consequences and that easy or exciting path isn't always the wisest one. What stands out to you about the way temptation is presented here?
Well, it highlights how easily we can be swayed,
Yeah.
by those sinful men, those voices whispering in our ears, whether it's our own internal doubts and fears or external pressures from society or those around us. It's a reminder to be discerning, to question those voices
Yeah.
and make sure they're aligned with our own values and that deeper sense of moral order that we were talking about.
Okay, so we've got this foundation of fearing the Lord, the sense of a bigger picture and a moral compass. Then we get this warning about the dangers of temptation and the consequences of giving in. Now, verses 20 to 21, they take kind of a turn here. We have this image of personified wisdom, like crying out in the public square, almost desperate to be heard.
Yeah, it's such a powerful image, isn't it?
Yeah.
Wisdom isn't hidden away. It's out in the open, pleading with people to listen. There's this real sense of urgency and even frustration in wisdom's voice.
It's like wisdom is saying, hey, I'm right here. I can help you avoid like pain and suffering. Why aren't you listening? And then, in verses 26 to 33, we see what happens when people choose to ignore wisdom's call. Disaster, calamity, self-destruction. It's a pretty stark contrast to the safety and peace promised to those who do listen. So what do you think is the takeaway for us here? I mean, what does it mean to listen to wisdom in our everyday lives?
I think it's about recognizing that wisdom's all around us, available to us if we're open to it. It's in the lessons we learn from our own experiences, in the advice from trusted mentors, even in those quiet moments of reflection when we connect with our own inner knowing.
So it's not just about, reading the book of Proverbs. It's about actively seeking wisdom in everything we do.
Exactly. And that's where the real challenge and the real reward lie.
It's interesting how this chapter seems to be setting up a choice. Embrace wisdom or face the consequences. It's not a threat, but more like a loving invitation.
And that's a theme that we're going to see continue to unfold throughout the book of Proverbs.
All right, so we've covered the purpose of seeking wisdom, the importance of fearing the Lord, the dangers of temptation, and the consequences of ignoring wisdom's call. Let's pause here for a moment. We'll pick up the conversation in part two of this deep dive.
Picking up where we left off, it's so interesting how this first chapter of Proverbs, it really lays the groundwork for the whole book. It's like the foundation that all those other wise sayings and teachings are built on.
Right. It's like chapter one sets up these core principles, and then the rest of Proverbs is about, diving into how those principles can be applied in all these different areas of life. But before we move on, I'm curious about something. You're talking about how chapter one sets up this choice between embracing wisdom and facing the consequences. Do you think that's like a one-time choice that we make, or is it something we're constantly navigating?
That's a great question. I think it's both, really. There are probably those big moments in our lives where we make a conscious decision to prioritize wisdom, to really seek out that guidance, and to try to live by those principles. But even then, it's not like we just, suddenly become wise and make perfect choices from that point on.
So it's more like a commitment, to a way of life, a path we choose to walk, knowing that there will be times we stumble or get off course.
Exactly. And that's where the ongoing practice comes in. It's about recognizing those moments when we're faced with a choice, big or small, and asking ourselves, what would a wise person do in this situation?
I love that. It's like having that inner compass, always available to us, but it's up to us to actually consult it, right?
Precisely. And it's interesting because even though the language of Proverbs, it might seem kind of ancient, the challenges and temptations we face, they haven't really changed that much over the centuries. You know what I mean?
That's so true. We might not be facing, literal bandits trying to lure us into robbing someone's house, but we all encounter those metaphorical crossroads, right? Where we have to choose between what's easy and what's right, between instant gratification and long-term fulfillment.
Yeah, absolutely.
So think about your own life for a moment. What are some of those, modern day temptations that you face? Those things that pull you away from making wise choices?
Oh, wow. There are so many. Um, For me, I think it's often about distractions.
Yeah.
Social media, that endless stream of news and information,
Mm.
the pressure to be constantly busy and productive. It's so easy to get caught up in all of that and lose sight of what truly matters. What about you? What are some of the things that you find yourself grappling with?
For me, it's often about perfectionism. I can get so caught up in trying to do everything perfectly that I end up, procrastinating or not even starting things at all. It's a form of fear, really fear of failure, fear of not being good enough. That's so relatable. And I think both of those examples, distractions and perfectionism, those are both ways that we try to avoid discomfort, right?
Uh,
It's easier to just scroll through our phones than to, face a challenging task or have a difficult conversation. It's easier to strive for perfection than to, embrace our imperfections and allow ourselves to be vulnerable.
Absolutely. And that's where the wisdom of Proverbs comes in. It reminds us that true fulfillment, it doesn't come from avoiding discomfort or chasing, fleeting pleasures. It comes from aligning ourselves with a higher purpose, from making choices that are in our best interest, even when they're difficult.
So it's about recognizing that those uncomfortable moments, those challenges and setbacks, they're not something to be avoided, but rather opportunities for growth and learning.
Exactly. And when we approach life from that perspective, those challenges, they become less intimidating. They become part of the journey, part of what shapes us and helps us develop, wisdom and resilience.
Hmm. I'm also struck by, how much Proverbs emphasizes personal responsibility. It's not about blaming external forces or making excuses. It's about recognizing that we have the power to choose our path
Yeah.
and that we're ultimately responsible for the consequences of those choices.
Yeah, that's such a crucial point. It's so easy to get caught up in feeling like, we're victims of circumstance. But Proverbs reminds us that we're not, passive passengers in our own lives. We have agency. We have the ability to choose, and that choice, it's incredibly empowering.
It's like a call to action, isn't it? To step into our own power, to
Right.
take ownership of our lives and to actively seek wisdom as a guide for our journey.
Exactly. And that leads us to one of the most beautiful aspects of Proverbs, I think.
Yeah.
The emphasis on co-creating our lives in partnership with wisdom. It's not about following a, rigid set of rules, but rather about, cultivating a relationship with a deeper knowing within ourselves and with a higher power, allowing that wisdom to guide our thoughts, our words, our actions.
And that's where true fulfillment lies, in that alignment, that sense of living in harmony with something bigger than ourselves.
Precisely. And it's a journey, a
Yeah.
lifelong process of learning and growth, of stumbling and getting back up, of constantly choosing to align ourselves with wisdom.
So we've talked about how the choices we make, those moments of decision, those are opportunities to practice wisdom. We've talked about the importance of personal responsibility and the power of co-creating our lives with wisdom. Is there anything else that stands out to you about this idea of actively choosing wisdom in our everyday lives?
Yeah, something that really resonates with me is the idea that choosing wisdom, it's not just about avoiding, negative consequences. It's also about cultivating a life filled with goodness, righteousness, and peace.
That's such a beautiful way to put it. So often we focus on what we don't want, the mistakes we want to avoid, the pain we want to prevent. But Proverbs, it encourages us to focus on what we do want. A life that's meaningful and fulfilling, a life that reflects our deepest values.
And when we shift our perspective in that way, I think it changes everything. Our choices, they
Mhm.
become less about fear and more about love, less about avoiding what we don't want and more about creating what we do want.
I love that. It's a much more empowering and inspiring way, to approach life. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to ask you this. If you could give one piece of advice to someone who's just starting to explore the wisdom of Proverbs, what would it be?
Hmm. I would say this. Approach Proverbs with an open heart and a curious mind. Don't get bogged down in trying to understand every verse perfectly. Instead, allow yourself to be moved by the poetry, the imagery, the wisdom that speaks to your soul. And most importantly, be willing to experiment. Try applying these principles, in your own life and see what happens. You might be surprised by the results.
That's such great advice, and I think it applies to anyone, whether you're new to Proverbs or you've been studying it for years, right? It's that willingness to stay open, to keep learning, to keep growing.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important aspect of choosing wisdom, I think,
Hmm.
the role of humility.
Ooh, that's interesting. Tell me more about that. How does humility, play into all of this?
Well, I think true wisdom, it requires a certain level of humility. You know, it's about acknowledging that we don't have all the answers, that we're constantly learning and evolving. It's about being open to different perspectives, even those that challenge our own beliefs. And and it's about recognizing that we're all in this together, that we need each other's support and guidance on this journey of life.
That makes so much sense. It's about, letting go of that need to be right all the time and embracing the unknown, the mystery, the possibility that there's always more to learn and it's about recognizing that we're not alone on this path.
Exactly. And that brings us to another beautiful aspect of Proverbs, I think, the emphasis on community.
Okay, I'm really intrigued now. Tell me more about, how community connects to wisdom.
Well, throughout Proverbs, we see this recurring theme of seeking out wise counsel, of surrounding ourselves with people who can support us on our journey. It's about recognizing that we don't have to figure everything out on our own.
So it's not just about, our own personal relationship with wisdom. It's also about recognizing the wisdom that exists in the collective.
Precisely. And that collective wisdom, it can come from a variety of sources.
Hmm.
Our families, our friends, our mentors, our communities. It's about being open to receiving guidance and support from those around us. And it's also about sharing our own wisdom and experiences with others.
I love that it creates this beautiful cycle, of giving and receiving, of learning and growing together.
Exactly. And that's where true transformation happens, both individually and collectively.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive. We've talked about the ongoing nature of choosing wisdom, the importance of personal responsibility, the power of co-creating our lives with wisdom, the role of humility, and the significance of community. Let's pause here for a moment, and in the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore some specific examples of how these principles can be applied in our everyday lives. Okay, so we've been unpacking a lot about the nature of wisdom itself, but let's get practical. You mentioned earlier how wisdom isn't just this abstract idea in Proverbs. It's almost like a character interacting with us.
Yeah, and it's fascinating how that personification makes wisdom relatable, right? It's not just this list of rules, it's like this dynamic force trying to get our attention. Think back to those verses, where wisdom is crying out in the public square, almost pleading with people to listen.
It's like she's saying, hey, I'm right here. I want to help you. Why aren't you paying attention? And if we connect that to the bigger picture, it almost suggests there's this constant energy, this wisdom available to us, if we tune in.
And that raises a really important question, right? How do we actually tune in? What does it mean to cultivate that receptivity to wisdom in our everyday lives?
Right, because it's not enough to just read about wisdom, right? We have to actually do something with it. So let's talk about some practical examples. Earlier, we were talking about, those modern day temptations we face, distractions, perfectionism, that desire for instant gratification. How can we apply the wisdom of Proverbs to navigate those challenges?
Well, let's take the example of distractions. We're just bombarded with information and stimulation, all the time. Social media, news, entertainment, it's so easy to get sucked in and lose focus on what's truly important.
It's like our attention is constantly being pulled in like a million different directions.
Exactly. And Proverbs reminds us to be mindful of what we're feeding our minds and our hearts. Remember those verses about, guarding your heart, for it's the wellspring of life. That applies not just to our, emotional well-being, but also to our intellectual and spiritual growth.
So it's about being intentional with what we consume, right?
Yeah.
Choosing, information and experiences that nourish us rather than deplete us.
Exactly. And that might mean, setting boundaries around social media use, being more selective about the news that we consume, or just making time for, activities that bring us joy and connect us to something, bigger than ourselves.
Okay, that makes sense for distractions. But what about perfectionism? How can the wisdom of Proverbs help us, overcome that tendency to get stuck in striving for the unattainable?
Well, Proverbs often talks about the importance of humility, and recognizing our limitations. There's a verse that says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding.
And earlier we talked about how fear in this context isn't about terror, but about respect and reverence for, something greater than ourselves. So how does that connect to overcoming perfectionism?
When we acknowledge that we're not perfect, that we don't have all the answers, I think it takes the pressure off. It allows us to embrace our imperfections, to learn from our mistakes, and to grow.
It's like giving ourselves permission to be human, to be a work in progress.
Exactly. And that's where true growth happens. When we let go of the need to be perfect, we open ourselves up to new possibilities, new ways of being and doing.
I love that. And it reminds me of something else we talked about earlier, the importance of community. How can we lean on others for support when we're, struggling with things like distractions or perfectionism?
Yeah, Proverbs is full of verses about seeking wise counsel, about surrounding yourself with people who can offer guidance and support. Remember, iron sharpens iron, and one man sharpens another.
So it's about recognizing that we don't have to go it alone. We can reach out to trusted friends, family members, mentors, or even therapists for help.
Exactly. And it's also about, being willing to offer support to others. Sometimes the best way to learn and grow is to help someone else, through their own challenges.
Yeah, it creates this beautiful sense of reciprocity, of shared wisdom and support. And that brings us back to that idea of, co-creating our lives in partnership with wisdom. It's not just an individual pursuit,
Yeah.
It's something we do together in community.
And when we approach life with that mindset, that open heart and that willingness to connect with wisdom, both individually and collectively, it can transform everything.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Proverbs chapter 1, I want to leave you with this thought. Imagine wisdom not just as a destination, but as a journey, a lifelong adventure of learning, growing, and becoming more fully ourselves.
And remember, you have the power to choose wisdom every day, in every moment. You can choose to pay attention to those whispers of wisdom within you, to seek out wise counsel from others, and to make choices that align with your values and lead you toward a life of meaning and purpose.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Proverbs 1. We hope this exploration has, sparked your curiosity and inspired you to continue seeking wisdom in your own life. And remember, the journey of wisdom, it's a lifelong adventure and the rewards are immeasurable.